first participant is Wojciech Roszkowski. I'm sorry for murdering that name in Polish. I'm a big fan of Professor Roszkowski because he's a renowned economic historian and writer, especially in Polish and European history on the 20th and 21st century. He was a member of the European Parliament from 2004 to 2009. From 1980 to 1983, he was a member of the historic trade union Solidarność. We all know and love what it meant for the history of Europe and the world. From 1990 to 1993, he served as vice rector of the Warsaw School of Economics. He has written several books about history and faith in the 20th and 21st century. His book, The World of Christ, A Complete History of the World Depicted During the Lifetime of Jesus Christ, was published in 2016 after over 50 years of investigative work. And his 2019 book, The Shattered Mirror, The Downfall of Western Civilization, which I highly recommend, was one of Poland's more read books. So, Professor Roszkowski. Yes.
Oh, okay. The question that I was asked to answer is, was communism better than Nazism? In fact, John Paul II lived under both systems, so the question seems very relevant. But comparisons of the two systems are, though they are a matter of never-ending debates among politicians, historians, these debates rarely refer to the real similarities and differences between the two systems. They are rather, I would even say, biased by the fact that the Communist Soviet Union was, at the end of war, the Communist Soviet Union was on the side of the good guys who won the war. And this is why Nazism was condemned, while communism was kind of justified. I say kind of, because it's not an open confirmation of communism, but a rather toleration of specificity of the Soviet Union, which was a big power, and the Western world had to talk and make agreements and so forth. So many politically oriented historians and political scientists treat the very comparison of the two systems as a kind of blasphemy, as if comparing the two systems would minimize the guilt of Nazism. I would say it the other way around. If we ignore the communist crimes, then the other thing happens, meaning we see the only evil in Nazism, we don't see any evil in communism. Why it is so? First of all, I already said, after the war, the Soviet Union was a respected even partner in the international relations. The problem is that many Western experts, historians, politicians, have had no experience, personal experience under communism. But if they act of ideological bias, which also happens very often, they, in my opinion, they bear serious responsibility for supporting what I call false memory. John Paul II is a good example of a person that lived under both systems, and let me remind very few facts. Soon after he grew of age, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. So for 5 years, he lived under the German Nazi occupation, with all the horrors that was, he witnessed all the horrors. In 1945, the Soviets came to Poland. There was a common knowledge of what the Soviets did in the Eastern Polish territories after 1939. That's a memory that is very often absent in Western minds, because for many Western experts, the war started in 1941, in fact. I once heard remarks from the BBC that the real war started in 1941, as if nothing happened before. And what happened was 1939, the invasion of Poland, 1940, Soviet and Nazi invasion of Poland, of Finland, Soviet invasion of Finland, and the Baltic states, 1940, the Soviet invasion of Romania, and so forth and so forth. So the knowledge of the Soviet atrocities and the Soviet aggression was pretty widespread, even under the German occupation of Poland. So when the Soviets came in 1945, young Karol Wojtyła knew very well about the dangers and the risks. And then he decided to enter the ministry. After all, many of his friends fought for Polish independence. They suffered from the German hands, from the Soviet hands. Soon after the war, many of them suffered from the new Polish communist authorities, while young Wojtyła became a priest. His decision, I think, was extraordinary, and I think it's worth it. I always, as if, try to put some kind of light, flashpoint, his decision under these circumstances. Okay. Reverend Bishop, Archbishop Cardinal Wojtyła ministered under very complicated conditions. The new communist Polish state, Soviet satellite, was very active in suppressing religion and Catholic Church in particular. As a result, in late 1940s and early 1950s, many Polish priests were imprisoned by the communists, and the church was very often slandered in public by the communist propaganda. What helped the Polish Catholic Church survive was, first of all, massive religiosity, as, for instance, expressed during the Polish millennium, the 1,000 years of Polish Christianity, celebrated in 1966. But of course, the other factor was very courageous service of thousands of priests, and Primate Stefan Cardinal Wyszyński in particular. Why Wojtyła became Krakow Metropolitan is a very interesting story, because it was a game that he played hand in hand with Primate Wyszyński, and in a way they won with the communist authorities that counted on conflict between them. They pretended they are going other ways, they worked together. Anyway, what I said may sound like the Polish communist system being quite tolerant. And that's not exactly true, because the anti-religious and anti-Catholic propaganda and various kinds of pressures were omnipresent. Even in the 1980s, as you know, in 1984, Reverend Jerzy Popiełuszko was brutally murdered by the Polish security people. It was even worse in other communist countries. We talk about communists, let's see what the communists did to the Catholic Church in these countries. When we talk about the treatment of the Catholic, of Christian churches, Catholic Church in particular, under communists, usually we mention thousands or 100,000 Talking about 100,000 makes a lesser impression than if you point at individuals. And let me quote at least the fate of several of these outstanding personalities. Cardinal Józef Mindszenty from Hungary, for instance. Cardinal Alojzije Stepinac from Croatia, a well-known name. Cardinal Józef Beran from Bohemia. Less known figures, archbishops murdered by the communists, brutally murdered. Franjo Gini from Albania, Evgeny Bosiukov from Bulgaria, Josif Tsarevich from Croatia, Livu Cinezu, Alexandru Rusu, Anton Durkovici from Romania, Greek Catholic bishops, Maria Tucci from Albania, a layperson, 5 sisters from Drina in Croatia, Sister Zdenka Szelingova, Sister Antonia Premrov from Slovenia. One of the persons that we don't know what happened to him really was the Bishop of Pyongyang in North Korea. His name was Francis Hing-Yong-ho. He was arrested in 1949, and the date of his death is not even known. He simply disappeared. We should also not forget the fate of Vietnamese Cardinal Francis Xavier Nguyen Van Thuan from Saigon, and so forth and so on. We could go on and on, but I think that the individual histories are important because they bring the story of communist persecution closer to our imagination. The question then arises whether personal experience is sufficient to judge individual personal experience. Of course not. If we compare the two systems, individual stories, but if you put together all these individual stories, the big story speaks for itself. At the end of the day, those who died due to Soviet atrocities would not care about the Nazi crimes, and vice versa. Those who suffered from communism, from Nazism, would not be able to compare. Personal experience of those who survived Nazism and those who survived communism may be different and incomparable, but it's up to all the conscious grown-ups to realize the similarities and the differences between two systems. Very briefly, communism was rooted in Marxism, which is a materialistic philosophy. For Marx, the concept of the fundamental philosophical concept of praxis was materialist. So he fought with religion. Religion was a dope for the fools, for the masses, yes. Moreover, Marx was perhaps the first philosopher who thought that philosophy is not the way of thinking, it's an instrument of doing things. Wrong things, definitely. Lenin changed Marxian theory of revolution into a practice of political revolution, in brief. And he demanded no mercy for the enemies of the people. The Bolshevik party that grabbed power in Russia became a highly disciplined organization of professionals acting along the lines of a document that everybody who studies communism should remember very well. It's the Catechism of a Revolutionary by Nikolai Bakunin or Sergei, I think, Nechayev. Unlimited terror, deceitful propaganda, mass murders, executions without legal procedure, torture and forced labor camps that were in fact death camps, all these measures were to justify the revolutionary end. And the case of communist rule resulted not only in dozens of millions of victims, murdered, deported, intellectually and morally broken, but also in distortion of vocabulary. Under communist democracy and dictatorship. Science meant deceitful ideology. Equality meant power of a new elite. Aggressive lies and naked force have always been and still remain in Russia basic instruments used to enslave societies. It was all based on illogical premises. Let's think what Marx said. Any system that claims satisfaction of all needs and asks only obedience and not obligation is doomed to fall. Human needs are unlimited, while the human readiness to sacrifice is, as we know, rather limited. The idea of nationalization, which means socialization, is absurd. Realization of heaven on earth by coercion or naked force is another absurd. Since unrealistic goals were farther and farther away under communism, power became a goal in itself. The system was more and more frequently called real socialism, as if people should have not expected anything more. The original sin of communism was moral relativism. Unfortunately, the idea that moral values are relative is still present. I have, unfortunately, a contemporary example of the French president, François Hollande, who once said to the new member country leaders, "You have the principles, we have the funds." Just like communism was not only the product of the degenerate mind of Marx, Lenin, and Stalin, Nazism was not only the lunatic invention of Hitler. Both totalitarian ideologies stemmed from the long tradition of radical European thought. The forerunners of nihilism, Max Stirner, Friedrich Nietzsche, heralds of racism, Arthur de Gobineau, Houston Chabel, and irrespective whether they could have imagined practical effects of their ideas, the followers of social Darwinism and eugenics paved the way for the racist ideology of the German Nazis. Oswald Sprenger, for instance, advocated the rule of the stronger and became the spokesman of the German pride. The German Nazis was a revolutionary ideology combining German nationalism and post-1918 revisionism with populism fed by the Great Depression. It was, according to Hermann Rauschnig, a revolution of nihilism, effectuated, in fact, by Bolshevik methods. In both communists and Nazis, the ruling party devoured the state and made the political police a driving force of the system based on terror and propaganda. The birth of the German nation as a positive idea soon degenerated by the assumption of the race superiority of the Germans and the race inferiority of the Jews and Slavs in the second place. The Nazi propaganda used simple slogans and massive lies. Any criticism was met with historical response, taken by surprise with its impudence and immorality. These two instruments, terror and propaganda, consolidated the German society to the extent that most moral inhibitions were gone. This led, for instance, to the murder of Polish POWs in 1939, to the treatment of the Soviet POWs during the war as well, and finally to the Holocaust, an unprecedented murder of millions of European Jews. Under Nazis, both reason and belief were degenerated. The belief in God was replaced by the belief in the Führer. And heaps of dead bodies found in German Nazi camps by the Anglo-Saxon soldiers after the war, at the end of war, were a shock to them. But when the Western people began to ask, where was God in Auschwitz? Hardly anyone asked, where was he put by those who perpetrated these crimes? The same question was never asked in Kolyma. Kolyma was a Soviet basin, Kolyma River basin, the place of the most horrible Soviet death camps. So this question was never asked there, simply because these camps were never liberated by Western soldiers. What was also similar for both systems was a cult of the infallible leader, Stalin and Hitler respectively, and secondly, the role of the evil enemy that should have been destroyed without hesitation. In this respect, both systems differed a little. Since the communist enemies of the people were distinguished by class criterion, whatever it means, while the enemies of the Nazis were distinguished by the race. Wasn't communism better than or worse than Nazis? My conclusion is that it's uncomparable. Both were totalitarian criminal systems that destroyed human lives, millions of human lives. And we should, in fact, what's the conclusion? We should probably never close our eyes on the evil caused by them and the evil which is in repeating their mistakes and their crimes. Thank you.